And thank you for joining us for this evening's installment in the lecture series on the New Middle East, the First World War 100 years later, which is sponsored jointly by the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and the Georgetown Institute for Global History. And I would like to thank my colleagues, Professors Mustafa Aksakal, Rochelle Davis, Fida Adeli, and Joseph Sassoon, for their leading role in conceptualizing and organizing this series. And my thanks also to our Public Affairs Coordinator, Elizabeth Sexton, for planning and arranging tonight's event. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest, Dr. Isam Nassar, who's Associate Professor of Middle East History at Illinois State University. Isam is co-editor of Jerusalem Quarterly and has authored and edited a number of books, the most recent being The Storyteller of Jerusalem, The Life and Times of Wasif Jawahiri, 1904-1948, co-edited with Professor Salim Tamari. Isam writes on the history of photography of the Middle East, and tonight's talk is based on his ongoing research on the photography of the Great War in the Ottoman lands. It's entitled Photographing the First World War in the Middle East, the Suez Campaign in Palestine, 1915. Professor Nassar will present for about 40 minutes, after which he will take your questions, which I hope you will make brief and to the point so that we can take as many of them as possible. My thanks to Professor Nassar for accepting our invitation to share his findings with us, and thank you all for joining me in welcoming him to the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies.
Thank you. Thank you, and thanks for the invitation and for the good organization. I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to look at some of the photographs of the war from the Ottoman front. And although I did originally send in my title 1915, but looking yesterday at the images, I'm actually looking at more than 1915. I'm getting a little bit into 1916, so it doesn't make much of a difference. As you know, photography photography basically is a product of the 19th century as we know it. And it came to light more or less around the same time as the discipline of history was canonized and came to light and became, not that there were no historians before, but with Ranka and the development of history as a social science, as a discipline, with Rankan kind of critique of the Hegelian view of history, with this whole theory of Ranka that became, well, oversimplified basically, but became popular in the statement of you write it the way it was. And perhaps Ranka was talking about history, but he might as well could have been talking about photography, which was also invented around the same time, and he doesn't seem to have paid much attention to it, although I did find some of his own pictures, studio portraits of him, so he was fully aware of it and practiced it. But the reason I'm mentioning this, because the invention of photography was received in the same way as that famous historical statement, or that famous statement of Ranka about depicting reality the way it is. That's how everyone celebrated history, celebrated the invention of photography at the time. It was seen as something that doesn't lie. The camera doesn't lie. It captures things the way they are. It doesn't alter reality. And it is an evidence later on would emerge even as an evidence that would be taken seriously in court. Many great writers and archaeologists and scientists wrote essays after essays praising this presumed objectivity of photography. At the same time, photography also was invented that same period. We're talking about roughly 1830s on, so 19th century basically. At the time when war had also evolved to become a much more larger phenomena in the way it is being conducted. this is the 19th century when wars are no longer just led as they used to be only 30 or 40 years before directly by the leader. You know, take the example of Napoleon in Egypt, for example. Now, leaders are far away, you know, in the 19th century. If we start to think of probably the major war in the 19th century, will be the Crimean War, which I'm sorry to what's happening in Crimea, but I'm so excited that finally when I talk to my students about the Crimean War, they know what I'm talking about. They know where that place is. Too bad. But in any case, the Crimean War probably was one of the first massively photographed wars, where photography all of a sudden emerged not only as a tool of documentation and tool of, you know, to be used in books and in newspaper articles. I mean, they could not yet print the pictures themselves. They created etchings or engravings from the photographs. For the printing, it will take, it won't be until the 1880s when the half-tone printing will emerge and we'll start seeing photographs appearing in books and in print, in magazine and what have you. But it is basically, we are talking about a century of major change on all sorts of levels, especially in the European context. And photography and war were an important element of that. Photography during the Crimean War was basically also used as a tool of planning, as a tool for the officers to know, or those in charge, planning in faraway places, what does the front look like? What's the landscape of the place? And of course, in the American Civil War, and maybe I should just mention that although the Crimean War is probably, when we're talking 1854, is probably the first heavily photographed war, the first photograph of war actually was in the Mexican-American War. But I think we're talking about possibly either one photograph, or I haven't seen it, or just a handful of photographs. So it was not yet used as part of the war machine in some sense. But the point is that photography was part of massive inventions and massive transformation in the world, with a process of industrialization, new ways of thinking, and certainly new ways of seeing things and looking at things. And in the case of the American Civil War, photography becomes an important tool to document as an eye of a historian, presumably, to document the war itself and the events of the war, and to celebrate them. And I'm sure we're all familiar with the photographs of Brady of the American Civil War, and Brady, of course, did not take those photographs. They're famous because he's a rich man who paid unknown photographers to go do the job for him. But in any case, we know that although they're mostly staged photographs, they were still photographs from the front, from real places. You can still see the landscape, you see actual soldiers, but the actual scenes they depicted were all staged. Photographers had to move bodies in order to create a cramped, disastrous scene of the war with young men dead everywhere. So they had to bring them together in order to fit within the frame. So basically, what I'm trying to say is photography was very much integrated already, not only in our social and political life, but also in our fights, in our wars. And photography was no stranger to the Ottoman Empire. Immediately after its official invention in 1839, photographers were dispatched throughout the world, basically, to document the world. And in no time, we would start having photographers from Europe initially, opening up shop in various parts of the world. And certainly among them, Istanbul would be one, but also Beirut and Jerusalem, and to a lesser extent Damascus, and of course Cairo, among other places. So photography by the end of the 19th century was well known, well utilized. We already have from the 1850s the Ottoman Sultan appointing official photographers for the court photographers. We have the Abdul Hamid collection in the Library of Congress, where photographers were sent to document the entire Ottoman lands, basically, and produce them in good album form, placed together in albums where you can see scenes of where the Sultan could at least see what his sultanate looks like and what kind of people live there, etc., etc. So it's kind of surprising that with all this background, that in my view, the Ottomans did not fully utilize photography during World War I. World War I was even, photographed heavier than any previous war, obviously, because it was a much larger war and there were so many nations involved and so many fronts. And we can easily find photographs of World War I practically in any country. Not to mention Google nowadays, but basically, in the French, in the British, and the English has the Imperial War Museum, where you can just go there, and there's so many photographs of World War I and other imperial wars, of course. And photography was heavily used by the various armies and troops. I'm sorry, do I use the mouse? In the case of the Ottomans, for example, this is from 1908, and we do have, well actually I don't know the date for this, I'm mixing it up with the next one, but we have previous photographs from the first decade of the 20th century that documented military, with some pride. Here is the, artillery brigade. And this is a postcard even produced in relationship to the first Balkan War. So it was starting to be used also as a tool of propaganda on some level. However, this is the only postcard I saw. I mean, there's another one I'll show you at the end about World War I, but that I saw that basically, does suggest that visual culture was to some extent used by the Ottomans as a tool of propaganda. But basically, in World War I, the core of the propaganda side of photography was heavily utilized in posters, not just postcards, but now in posters and in film, which I don't know much about, but clearly in posters where you see posters like this recruiting for either the army itself or for the medical career, the nurses for the front, or what have you, coming from all sides, including the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. In fact, one of the best photographers of World War I was an Austro-Hungarian photographer, or an Austrian photographer, but that's not something that we'll be talking about now. In the case of the Palestine front, now we all know that the Ottoman Empire in 1915 decided, well maybe 1914, but they decided that they're going to launch that major attack on the Suez Canal in order to retake Egypt. And this was a major decision. I mean, true, it's not the center of the Ottoman Empire. Palestine is on the periphery, and the Sinai Peninsula is kind of far away, but this was made into a big deal. That we even have one of the most powerful men in the Ottoman cabinet and the Ottoman armed forces, Jabal Pasha himself, be assuming control of this campaign and forming the Fourth Army especially for this campaign. So lots of noise about this major campaign that they were hoping to win. And in Palestine were the headquarters of the campaign, at least the planning for the campaign. Damascus was the headquarters for Jamal Pasha, but he spent some time in Palestine. In Palestine, we already see that there were official photographers. This idea of official photographers must have become so popular that you find around the early 20th century that every photographer not every, but most of studio photographers in various parts of the world sign next to their name, I'm the official photographer of so-and-so. And in the case of Jamal Pasha, which is kind of unusual, usually when we're talking about official photographers, we're talking about official photographers of institutions or emperors or sultans, not an although very important army officer. But in the case of Jamal Pasha, we have these two guys from Jerusalem who both claim to be the official photographers of Jamal Pasha. And it seems like that is an easy claim to make, because I don't know, you just put it on your business card or on your signature on the photograph. These guys are Khalil, both are Jerusalem-born photographers who learned photography in Jerusalem. However, interestingly enough, John Whiting, although born in Jerusalem and raised in Jerusalem and lived most of his life in Jerusalem, is an American and a son of missionaries. And Khalil Rad, born in Jerusalem, raised in Jerusalem and died in Jerusalem, is from southern Lebanon, which at the time, there were no borders, and you could say it's kind of part of Palestine in a sense. Now, both photographers in their collections and archives, in the case of Whiting, it's the Library of Congress, and in the case of Khalil Rad, it's the Institute for Palestine Studies in Beirut. In their collections, we find many pictures of the front, particularly the Palestine front, and then, of course, the Sinai front. And in the case of Whiting, we have this album that you can find in the Library of Congress. Two albums in the Library of Congress. The first one is devoted fully to the Suez Campaign, to World War I in Palestine. And what's interesting about this album is the fact that it is an album. It is organized by someone, and it has captions and dates. In some sense, it suggests to you a particular narrative. Someone sat and thought how to organize these pictures in a way that you will end up hearing a particular kind of story. Now, John Whiting, as we know from his papers in Jerusalem at the American colony, where he used to live, which at the American colony today sounds like it is a hotel, so people think, it was a missionary group at the time, so we're not talking about the hotel, not the same building. In his papers, he actually talks about being commissioned by the Ottoman Red Crescent Society to photograph their activity during the war on the Sinai front. However, in doing so, he must have, had other assignments, because the album is primarily a personal album of Jamal Pasha and his life and his activities, despite the fact that we have nurses and doctors entering in and out. And of course, on page 1, we have this great picture, not so great, but this photograph of Jamal Pasha on his horse on the shores of the Dead Sea. And that's how the album of the war opens. So this is not the Ottoman War. I mean, we have examples like this were common at the time, to have an opening photo or some sort of dedication. For example, the recently published memoirs of Wasf Johariya, mentioned earlier, that I co-edited with Salim Tabari. Johariya, in his photo albums, his first page is the picture of the two last sultans of the Ottoman Empire, and he dedicates it to the sultan. Now, of course, Johariya this was like his personal photo album in his drawer, in his cabinet somewhere in the old city of Jerusalem. He was not the same, as well known as John Whiting, whose pictures appeared in American press and were sold in Jerusalem in the photographic shop that the American colony owned at the time. But still, the whole idea is you dedicate it, you start with an idol or with a ruler, and Johariya started with the Sultan, which makes kind of more sense. But here, we start with Jamal Pasha. He is this war, in a sense. Almost as if we're talking about the Jamal, I don't know, Sultanate or Jamal Pasha or something like this. He's elated to that level in a way. The photographs in this collection, in this album, many of them are of Jamal Pasha posing with either dignitaries, visitors, or places he visited. This is, in this case, the visit of Anwar Pasha, the Minister of Defense at the time, to Syria and Palestine, and this is in Jerusalem, in the place that was the headquarters of the 4th Army in Jerusalem. We see Jamal Pasha again appearing with members of the Turkish Parliament. I don't know why it says Turkish in this case, but this is put together after the fact. So, and we see Jamal Pasha in front of his staff, basically standing in almost a majestic way and distinguishing himself from the rest of the crowd by being, in the front. This is a photograph that is to be found both in the album of Whiting, the same exact photograph, and in the Khalil Raad collection at the Institute for Palestine Studies. And both collections actually have a negative for it. So did Khalil Raad work for Whiting and the American colony, or did they sell photographs to each other? It's not clear. And it's also puzzling that you can have a negative of the same image. Of course, you can reproduce a negative, but it's really hard to tell which is the original. I'm more inclined to say Khalil Raad in this case, since he's an individual, while the American colony was an organization that hired many other photographers sometimes for help. So it could be that he was hired by them at that time, and maybe that's where he got the idea that he was the official photographer of Jamal Pasha. But that's just a possibility. In the album, we see a story, we see images of troops basically marching towards Jerusalem even before the war, and in this case, 1914, marching from Jerusalem towards the Suez Canal. I probably won't read quotations, but in the written narrative of the war at the time in Palestine, the beginning of the war in Palestine, and in the entire Ottoman Empire, but in written narratives from where those pictures came from or were taken, we have plenty of evidence from, say, Khalil Sakakini, the educator who wrote his diary and notebooks. Every day he had an entry from Wasf Johariya, whose memoirs, the musician of Jerusalem, who wrote memoirs from the period, and they were written in the period. They were not exactly diary entries. And the diaries of Hassan Turjman, the soldier in Jerusalem, the Ottoman soldier in Jerusalem. All of them talk about the hardships and that particular day when the war was announced, and all three of them suggest to us that there is no way the Ottomans will survive this war. Khalil Sakakini's entry particularly talks about how the soldiers had no shoes. How could they march in this heat all the way to the Suez Canal without even shoes, without appropriate clothing, uniforms? So thinking about this kind of background, and also thinking about the entire idea of the conscription, the Safar Barlik, and its legacy in the region, I am inclined to think that those photographs of troops neatly appearing, organized, with boots and with guns and in order, are probably of special, either elite forces or of special, troops that were prepared to march on that day, or the 40 or 50 men who had their equipment, because this stands in direct contrast with the rest, with the other images coming from the text. Just to show you a page of the album that I'm not lying to you, it is an album, and you can see basically here is the visit of Anwar Pasha. You can follow Anwar Pasha basically from one place to the next. And of course, Jamal is always there in the center of the picture, and you can follow when he arrived, when he left, etc., etc. You also have in the album images of officers, German officers. Not many, but there are images of German officers, as if one gets the feeling, of course this is all subjective, but I think if you spend a lot of time with the album looking at it, going over and over again, you start feeling that why in the middle of all this we have now the image of important German officers. And my guess would be it's almost like showing off that I am connected with these German officers. They were there. But they're not highlighted other than the one or two images of them. Their role is not highlighted, contrary to what we know about them at least, or from the German side, or even from the English side that claimed that they were responsible for the war, basically. But we see, again, also images of officers, and again, organized troops, in this case with Jamal Pasha inspecting them. Now we're moving out of Jerusalem and we're moving closer to the front, and Bir Saba or Bir Sheva in southern Palestine becomes an important center. This is still in Jerusalem, outside of Jerusalem, but Bir Saba will become the center for the army, out of which all mobilization and operations will be planned. So we start to see more and more movement towards Gaza and towards Bir Saba and eventually towards the Sinai front. The few pictures that don't have troops being inspected by the Pasha himself or by some other high-ranking official are photographs of troops in what seems to be fighting. So you get the feeling that this is an actual war photograph. However, it's probably not, because it is clearly, in one sense or another, staged. I mean, they're all busy exactly at the same time, looking in the same place. They're all using their equipment. None of them is yawning or sitting in some way. So clearly they're neatly organized. And not to mention, if they were actually engaged in fighting, the angle from which the photograph is taken suggests that the photographer was standing there with probably his heavy, at the time, kind of bulky, I would imagine most likely Kodak camera or something else, and which would mean that he would be shot easily, if everyone is down. So, clearly these are staged images, like in other places, and this is another clearly staged image. So we start to have these images, but of course, if we compare them to the images of the officers, we can't even see a face of a single, distinguish the features of a single soldier. So far, soldiers don't appear in, they're like the pawns basically, but it's all the brilliance of the Pasha and the officers. And of course, there are, since his main commission was with the Red Crescent, so we also start to see images of field hospitals. We'll see images of operations, and of course, all the doctors are identified, and so it's more carefully planned. And then we also see, celebrations of the arrival of the troops in various areas of Palestine at this point. And the very last, this is an album, by the way, it has about 247, not about, it has 247 photographs. And it starts with Jamal Pasha and it ends up with this image. This is an image from 1916, I believe, when the capitulations were cancelled and the foreign post offices in the Ottoman Empire were removed. No more French or British or whatever, or even German post offices. So this is the removal of the French, the closure of the French post office in Jerusalem, which gives you the feeling somehow, I mean, if you want to again look at the album as a narrative, here we start with Jamal Pasha, we see all the troops, etc., and then at the end, the biggest achievement that closes the album is that they close down the post offices. Of course, that's probably not the intention, but it is possible that was the only kind of victory the Fourth Army had in Palestine, in a sense. But I'll get to that later. Now, in contrast with the Anatolian front in general and Gallipoli, there are no pictures of fighting, no postcards. This is a postcard, German postcard about Gallipoli. We have, I'll get back to that. We have the only postcard I could find that celebrated and of course this is not an actual picture. I mean, I'm sure based on photographs it was drawn, but it seems like the troops are about to take over the canal. I don't know if they actually made it to the canal. I mean,
just a few did. A few did.
Yeah.
And arrived as prisoners of war.
So there was that element that, of course, here maybe we don't see it in the book because it doesn't have Jamal Pasha in that case. Or okay, I'm going to go back here. Now I want to stop at the work of Khalil Rad a little bit, and this is not in the album anymore. This is in the collection of Khalil Rad. In Khalil Rad, we see several images in his work of Jamal Pasha in studio portraits. In different positions. And of course that has become already kind of a tradition in photographing leaders and emperors, such as the Kaiser over here. The kind of replacement of the Renaissance paintings of the king or of the pope with all the majesty. We have that kind of typical pose that Khalil Rad is trying to imitate in the case of Jamal Pasha. It's kind of puzzling. I mean, other than, of course he died a century ago, or less than a century ago, and the only thing we have is his memoirs, so we cannot psychoanalyze Jamal Pasha. But if all these pictures indicate something, they indicate that what mattered really was building this great character and setting him up for to be the leader who's gonna break the English. And so there is clearly, possibly, some political ambition over there in dealing with the photography of this particular front. In this case, the Pasha appears here in a pose that usually is reserved for heads of states. Of course, Khalil Rad is not as meticulous as the photographer of the Kaiser, so he's not standing as straight, but still the almost clumsy way by which he's imitating the pose of the leaders almost humanizes him. It almost gives him this face compared to the stern face and this is just one example. I mean, you can find many of those. Compared to the stern face, here you can almost see a hint of a smile almost. Of course, we're talking about Jamal Pasha, who was called at the time, and this is taken in Jerusalem in the studio of Khalil Rad, and Jamal Pasha was known as a Safah, the bloodshedder or the butcher, basically, more or less. So he had that reputation, basically, of being merciless. And yet, Khalil Rad manages to kind of almost produce a picture where he does resemble strong authority, yet there is this almost a hint of a smile, an attempt to humanize him in some sense or another. Anyway, this is the problem with talking and looking at pictures, that one forgets, you lose track sometimes because pictures are appealing. The main point I'm trying to make is that, to go back to my very first, to the beginning, where I stated that photographs were seen as basically telling the truth. And that's it. This is the objective reality, etc., etc. Photographs were almost thought of as historical evidence. I say almost, I mean, I believe they are historical evidence in their own way, but almost because even to this day, historians still don't take photography seriously. Very few would write concrete accounts based on photographs. We're still obsessed with the document in some sense. But photography was seen as something that does not lie. It was seen as a basically, historicist. You see the context. You see what's behind. Let's just see a picture of. Okay, so you see the context, you know the time, you know the climate, you see the players. Even if they're staged, it's there somehow. There's this claim that it does not lie in some sense, it does tell the truth. However, the truth of the Suez Campaign was that it was the biggest disaster the Ottoman Empire engaged in. It was basically, I don't know if the biggest, I mean the whole war, well, the war was the biggest probably, but I'll leave that to you. But it was basically shambles. The Ottomans were defeated, soldiers died in the front, not on the front, in the desert, from lack of water, from not being able to walk without their shoes. We have accounts like this. And basically it was, in every account or record we have from various areas, it's all about brutality, etc., etc. But yet in this album, which is, who knows why it was produced, we don't know, it doesn't say why. Why was it put together as an album? Or in the photographs of Khalil Rad, who claims to be commissioned by Jamal Pasha, we are seeing a road to victory, in some sense. We are not even seeing the kind of images that came out of Gallipoli, for example, where photographers did take images of dead soldiers and the atrocities that took place. And if we compare it even to the photography of the British soldiers that were on the other side when they crossed the Suez Canal, they had a photographer with them with the name of Kitchener, and he's not the same Kitchener, the famous Kitchener, probably the same family, who knows, who intentionally, like Brady in World War I, in American Civil War, would gather the corpses of the soldiers and take images and take pictures, and he would make sure that those pictures go around in camp, shown to all the soldiers. He left a diary about it, so proud that he always showed the soldiers that if you don't fight hard, this is what's going to happen to you. So it was kind of an internal form of propaganda to the soldiers to make them want to fight more. But on the Ottoman side, all we have are those photographs. Of course, those photographs of when Jamal Pasha was there, Jamal Pasha would visit every now and then, so probably the photographers were not on the front. They came with Jamal Pasha at some point. The other thing where is the map? Sorry. This is a map of the Suez Campaign. And it seems that this was the attack that was going to get the British busy thinking that that is the main attack, while the other the actual main attack is going to come from south. All the photographs we have are from this line. So they're also coming from, this like big attempt to fool the British. So it's possible that all this hoopla and, was meant somehow to make the British, realize that a major campaign is coming with all these leaders. I'm not sure, but it's a possibility. I'm not sure, mostly because these pictures were not published in newspapers. Those photographs were basically placed in an album. Why? It's very strange. I mean, the only logical conclusion could be that, Jamal Pasha wanted to prepare himself. He wanted to have his personal history when he becomes such a great man in the future. I don't know. This is all possibilities. But what we have here in way of conclusion, have I done the 30 minutes or 40 minutes? Or?
We are now, my battery is low on my watch, but I think it's now 20 till, is that right? 20 till.
Okay,
Yeah, you're fine, yeah.
Okay, thanks. Okay, in this case, then I'll talk a little bit more. Basically, the photograph, the camera was not the witness to history. The camera clearly in the Suez Campaign on the Ottoman side was trying to manufacture history. So instead of telling the truth somehow, it was twisting the truth that it will look so glorious and so great. We don't have photographs of regular soldiers. We don't have photographs of the atrocities, although we have from other photographers seen images of the hangings, for example, in Beirut and Damascus and Jerusalem, ordered by the Jamal Pasha. None of that appears in the album. Basically, what we have is what I would say an evidence contrary to the major claim that photography does not lie. In fact, it does, and in this case, it did. And though these photographs are not useless altogether, they are from the scene and they are of important people who participated in the war, and we can learn a lot from them. But one has to approach them very carefully and to raise a major question about whether the Ottomans seriously did take photography, at least in the case of the Suez Campaign, as a tool of historical documentation and as a tool of propaganda or not. And to what extent was the efforts of Jamal Pasha, if indeed this album was produced for the benefit of Jamal Pasha, to what extent was Jamal Pasha seriously in control or just showing off? I'm not saying he wasn't in control, but was seriously engaged in preparing for the battle, rather than just inspecting the troops and making sure his photograph is taken all the time. And we're talking about 1914 here, 1915, 1916. I know nowadays presidents and leaders always have their pictures taken everywhere and they know how to pose and etc. But at that time, this was a major endeavor. This is the photographer who traveled to the front had to carry with him glass negatives, had to carry chemicals with him, had to set up a tent to become the dark room to process and print the photographs. So it wasn't an easy thing. It was something that he knew that this is it. This is the day to act in certain ways, I suppose. And with that, I'm just going to conclude by basically challenging, stating that my conclusion is that the historicity of the photograph is in big questions, and it leaves us wondering why, among all the efforts of the Ottomans and the widespread use of photography before the war, we basically don't have any serious documentation, photographic documentation of the how harsh and how terrible the war was. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Islam, and we're opening the floor for your questions. Just please raise your hand if you don't mind.
Of course,
Just a point of clarification, the photograph of the Kaiser is not on the album.
No, it's not in that one, just for comparison purposes. Yeah.
I was just wondering, I mean, I know that the Rod and the Whitting images didn't really circulate, but could you talk about the market for photographs in general, maybe postcard photographs or as home furnishings or things like this in the empire at the time?
Of course, in the world in general, particularly in Europe, in the 19th century, there was a major market for photographs. People thought of photography in some sense, at least it was marketed as travel the world without ever leaving your chair. So you know, people collected photographs, and even when they traveled places, they did not necessarily take their own camera. It was bulky, etc., expensive. They didn't know how to handle it. So on their trips, they would buy photographs. So for that purposes, in all major destinations for tourists or pilgrims, there were photographers just selling photographs from the location. So instead of taking your picture when you arrive in Jerusalem, you just buy a picture of Jerusalem from the American Colony store, for example, which exactly sold these kinds of images. And in the case of the United States, for example, there was a particular popularity for the Civil War, I was going to say Civil War photographs. They were in high demand. People wanted to see how it is really out there. And clearly, they played some role in the, I don't know, like building support for the North, at least, in the war, and are probably an important element now in thinking about American patriotism and the history of the United States. And in the Ottoman world, you had the same. You had basically you had the carte de visite, and before that you had the stereoscopic images where you see it in 3 dimensions, sold everywhere basically from Egypt to Palestine to Syria to Istanbul. And most of the time they were kind of the predictable places, you know, the pyramids or the Dome of the Rock or those kinds of things. And there were captions, or on the back of the photograph you would have full description of the place and quotations possibly from the Bible or from other sources. So that was rather popular, but during the war, it's not clear that that market was active, even that market. In the case of Palestine, which I know more about, and in the case of Jerusalem, I noticed that most of the photographs that were sold and continued to be sold of the holy places and archaeological sites were either produced in the 19th century or later on in the 1920s and on. But it doesn't seem that this particular war period was particularly a period in which photographers were free to engage in these kinds of activities. The only activity that was rather popular right before or in the first year of the war was that studio photographers were taking pictures of soldiers who were conscripted. So they would be in their uniform, 2 or 3 of them together, standing together, friends or something like this, and they will take that picture. And it is probably to leave it with the family in case they never come back, which was a good possibility, as you know. So I am not aware of war photographs being sold or distributed on the market, at least in the Ottoman context. Yeah.
Thank you for this talk, Sam. In following up on your question, and in this whole sort of vein of staged photography, it makes me think of your other work on Palestine and in trying to go back and look at Palestine during this period via photographs, and the incredible number of staged photographs, all staged around biblical themes.
Mm-hmm.
So there was this whole, before the war and after the war, there was this whole tradition of, I mean, I use that word lightly, but of making peasants stand out in the field and be Ruth and Boaz.
Yeah.
And then, you know, and it's so hard in some ways to find photographs of Palestine that aren't by Khalil Rad and the other photographers in Palestine that aren't these staged photographs about from the Bible. I mean, I know you've written on this, but do you see any parallels then between this kind of staging of life as well as the staging of the war? Because I mean, it just seems to me that there's such a kind of continuation.
Well, that's very interesting. It did not occur to me, and I think that there must be something there. Clearly, I mean, it does to think about it. It does seem that this is all the photographers knew how to do, in some sense, is to stage things, be it for the market, tourist market abroad or pilgrimage market abroad, or be it for the benefit of the military rulers or dictators or what have you. Of course, there are the other photographs, but those all belong to the realm of the private family, and they're mostly post-Ottoman period. Although they start with the Ottoman period, because cameras became accessible basically from the 1890s or 1888 on, after the duplex camera was invented, it became more accessible somehow. So, wealthy people started to take pictures of their own parties and of their own fun and to do certain things, but certainly those professional photographers were never engaged in that kind of photography. At least we don't see it in their collections. Well, that's a great thing for me to think about. Thanks, Pasha.
But it's not the available technology at the time. It lent itself to stage photography, right? Because motion and movement tended not to be captured very well.
Not by the time of the war, but initially, yes. Initially, you needed a long time. I mean, of course, the first photograph, you needed to pose in front of the camera for 6 minutes. And, early portrait images, the photographers had in their studio all these metal things that will hold your neck so you don't move, you won't see it. So they were, but by the time of World War I, by 1888, after the invention of the film, the celluloid film by Kodak and small cameras, actually the shutter time was reduced significantly. That it's probably, I mean, you probably couldn't take a basketball player, but movement of soldiers, clearly something like this, people walking, you can.
And how expensive was it for a family to purchase a photograph, for example? Is this something that we're not going to be talking about a mass market, but was it accessible to all sorts of people, or just?
If we're talking about the local native population, if we're talking about, for example, in the case of Palestine, let's say Jerusalem, only the elites would be able to purchase photographs, not because they were expensive, but they were also not welcomed. They were not seen by the majority of people as something legitimate. There was still this whole, interpretation related to the Quranic text that you cannot depict God and His creation, and the same thing with the Jewish Torah. So, the majority, which happened to be Muslim, very small minority of Jews, but the majority basically had a hostile attitude towards their photographs being taken or keeping photographs. So it was popular within the realm of kind of Christian aristocratic groups or Muslims who belong to that group without necessarily being Christians, but not very the Ayan, so to speak. So it wasn't as accessible. It wasn't also was probably very expensive for the peasantry or for regular folks to have photographs. Yes?
I found your analysis of Jamal Pasha's albums very persuasive, but I've seen the American colony photos of the locusts as well, and the locusts certainly weren't posing for the camera. So this seems to be giving us something else, kind of a better historical source. Is that exceptional, or is the American colony collection also possibly a source for other kinds of?
Well, it is a source for all sorts of things. In fact, the locust pictures were taken by John Whiting, And they were taken in 1915. He was commissioned by the National Geographic to take those pictures, and I think a number of other also scientific societies that wanted close-up of the Holocaust and what have you. And very interesting, some of them you even have not just a close-up, but you have some sort of measuring stick or yard somewhere where you can also get a feeling that this is, I don't know, 2 centimeters big or so. This is the only collection within the American colony that dealt with anything that is away from social life or political or biblical history. Over time, the American colony covered a good deal of the Middle East, even all the way to Iraq, but this is all the way to 1946 when the last day of when they closed shop. But before that, in the beginning, photographs were used. Of course, there are lots of pictures of family life and the visitors and stuff like this, but were primarily used to document, to be sold for pilgrims and tourists. So the core of the photographs from late 19th century, late Ottoman period, and even early British Mandate were mostly photographs of the Holy Sepulchre, the Nativity, that kind of reenactment of biblical scene, and they must have been the major source for income for them because they were heavily not only sold in Jerusalem, they were sold in the United States and they were sold in Europe and other places. But it's a great collection. I mean, you must have seen it. I think they have, I forgot, is it like 11,000 negatives or something like this? Yes?
I find this idea of the construction of a narrative very interesting, and I would be interested to know if you were able to identify when exactly was the decision taken, mainly in terms of the political and historical context, because clearly 1915 is the weakening of the Ottoman Empire and foreign penetration, and the escalation of the First World War. When was the decision taken internally, and were we able to identify what precisely triggered the perception of a threat and the need to stage somehow photographs which show the representatives in a powerful position?
Yeah. Well, this particular album has dates. So it starts in 1915 and it has images in 1917. So it actually, we have already known when the album was put together that the Suez Campaign was a failure. So it wasn't just on the spot where, we're hoping we're going to win and then everything was in a mess that they forgot to add the pictures of the failure. So no, clearly someone later on decided to put it together. What's puzzling about this album is that it's presumably the work of Whiting, or assistants, but it's dedicated to him. There's a dedication to him and his wife Grace on page 1. And you get some information that basically states that before he left to the United States, when he left the American colony gave him this as a gift, basically, an album of his work. Still, he's not in the album whatsoever. I mean, it's all, in the first album is all Jamal Pasha, and the second one is all LMB. So he shifts sides. And of course we have his papers are available in Jerusalem, and now they have an American colony archive that doesn't have the photographs, but have the papers of the members of the colony at the time. And he admits of being at the time a British spy. Now these pictures are not particularly, if he leaked some of them to the British, I don't know what could they benefit from Jamal Pasha on his horse at the Dead Sea. But the other thing is that, of course, it's all guesses, but part of the market at the time, and in the 19th century, starting probably in, Victorian age in Britain, I think Queen Victoria was among the first to collect photographs in albums. People not only bought images, photographs, they also bought albums that told the story. So, and that, in the case of Jerusalem, that was particularly popular, where dignitaries were presented with an album of Jerusalem, and not only did you have the pictures, but you had like olive wood on the cover, and dried plants, flowers inside, and different smells. So there were all these attempts to kind of produce a film, almost, or write a book through the album. So it's possible that this album was also put for sale, or maybe the American colony wanted to sell it to officers, or to make, who knows, how many copies Jamal Pasha gave as gifts. That's all possible. However, the only source we have, the only version of that album we know of, is the one that is at the Library of Congress right now. So if that was the case, then they were lost. But it remains a possibility. But it's definitely was put together late in 1917, if not after.
Islam, has anybody ever looked in the British archives to see if there are photographs from John Whiting that he sent back as a spy? Because if he sent them as negatives, right, they wouldn't be in the collection, the American colony collection, right?
Yeah, I don't know if anyone looked into that. I certainly didn't, but it's something to keep in mind.
Because maybe he was taking not staged
Spy-like.
photographs, but photographs and sent them back.
But he would know the location of Jamal Pasha, right? Which might be pretty
But-
valuable information.
Yeah, but that, you know, with the telegraph or the phone, you can convey that. But the photograph needed at the time, I don't know how many
It's an
weeks.
elaborate setup. It's a skill he had. But I just want to make the comment that the album strikes me as something that Jamal Pasha would have used to report back to Istanbul, reporting what kind of great and terrific job he's doing.
Yeah.
And some of the scenes from Beersheba and so on, those are sort of, they were supposed to be model military sort of bases, which were built new during the war by Jamal, and he also built other roads and other infrastructure and so on. And so those, I assume, he would have sent sort of pictures piecemeal, right, based on that theory. But as you pointed out, none of those things, copies of the album or just of individual pictures, have surfaced in Istanbul or anywhere else.
Yeah.
I want to make a couple of other observations, if I may. So this card here that you have, that would be clearly for consumption in Germany,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting that Enver appears on it and not Jamal. That's probably not to Jamal's liking. But then the whole scene is fabulously, it's nuts, right? That's supposed to be a British vessel right there coming down the Suez Canal. But then you see Ottoman, you see,
And it's also not World War I era, right? It's earlier. The ship
Is it?
with the is that a sail rigging up there?
Yeah, it looks like a sail, yeah.
That's probably from the opening of the Suez Canal. Okay.
And then, but then you have the Ottoman cavalry. You have the Ottoman cavalry just sort of accompanying this British vessel, and then these guys down here are almost like they're ready to pounce on the vessel when it comes by or something.
Yeah.
And also they launched the attack at night, which would have been tough to capture in photography.
Yeah.
So. But
And you know, it looks like coming out of Lawrence of Arabia or something like this, you know. The regular army versus the kind of Bedouin, or even separate, you know, not working together almost.
Yeah. So, but I did want to ask you to compare some of the Matson collection at the Library of Congress, or some of the other American colonies, or the picture that Lowell Thomas took of Lawrence of Arabia. How do those differ in, or you know, in terms of the quality of getting at something that's not the high narrative of Jamal Pasha?
Well, the American colony photographs of World War I are all part of the Whiting collection. So there isn't much difference over there. I mean, but if we're comparing the other parts of Matson work, Matson clearly did not photographed during that time. He must have been very young. Though the collection is his name. He was born in the 1889 or something like this. So I don't know if he had already practiced photography or not at the time. But if you compare those images with, for example, the Australians, there was a Hurley, I think his name, Frank Hurley, was a photographer with the Australian Army who produced some of the first colored images, Actachrome images, and the color photography was just invented of the troops, of the Australian troops, that includes also their arrival in Palestine, which would be after the war, but kind of into 1918, 1919. In those pictures that I'm familiar with, in this case, not much emphasis on the leaders. It's mostly troops marching in different areas, and in fact, they're beautiful because they're in color, and it's brilliant color, and it's not fully colored, you color them afterwards, so parts are colored, parts are not. But so they're great pictures, but more or less, it's almost the same picture in different locations. The troops, when they arrived in Jerusalem, the troops in Sinai, or I'm making this up actually, I don't remember the locations. I know the photographs of Jerusalem, but in various areas. So it seems there was more of an interest in the army rather than the great officer or the great Pasha. And that's, on the Western Front, as we all know, we've seen the images. The French war on the Western Front was heavily documented. And probably, I don't know if we can make that claim, but maybe to some little extent, the photography of the French war might have helped in the outcry eventually and the banning of certain weapons in the future, including chemical weapons, because that was all photographed. So the eye of the, journalist, I suppose, in the modern sense, seemed to have been there, and clearly on the Western fronts, all of them, be it on the German side or on the, but only in the Ottoman, and I probably am more tempted, thinking also of your work, to compare more with the Russian. I haven't, because I'm not familiar with that yet. I haven't looked at the Russian photography of the war, but I'm tempted to do that comparison because I think they're more in common in terms of the organization and the ambitions of leaders in the Russian army, and various officers working on their own almost for their own ambitions. So, but I haven't done that comparison. But certainly the Suez Campaign stands out as something completely different from the rest.
By the way, Jamal never accepted that it was a failure, right? So the construction, the narrative continues in different ways. But.
What he believes he conquered Egypt?
Well, no, but he engaged in a long argument to make the case that the purpose was never to conquer Egypt, but to show forth at the Suez Canal in the hope that Egyptians would then rise up against British colonial rule. And so that didn't happen, and then he had different reasons for explaining that.
Yeah, and then there was the Arab revolt, which he goes on.
Yeah. So he shifted the responsibility
exactly.
to the, inert Egyptians.
I just have a question about this photo, and maybe you've mentioned it, missed it, but are there German photographs from the Ottoman Empire and the battles fought there?
Not battles, actually. The German and the Austrian Air Force did a splendid job in what do you call it, aerial photography. And we have, in the Austrian archive, I believe, you can see, basically the entire front. However, what always puzzled me, and for example, in the case of Palestine, now Palestine, the Ottoman the war ended 1918, as we all know, but Jerusalem fell in December 1917. So the aerial photographs, of course, Nablus took about a month later, Jericho a little bit later, so it took some time. But still, this is like, about 10 months at least before the official war was over. The aerial photographs of the Austrians are all in 1918. Which is, of course, aerial photography was, not as easy as it is today. I mean, someone had physically to be in the plane and take the photographs. But there's splendid photographs of this. It's almost like the Google Earth of World War I. But it seems that they were taken after the fall of certain areas. So whether it was for future military planning, I mean, I'm not sure, or...
But there are no German, has anybody looked in the German
I
archives?
personally haven't, but I don't know the answer to that.
Do you think that's a German?
I think that's a German photo. I mean, it's not a photo, it's a drawing, but it's clearly based on collection of photos. I've seen a photo like this.
Okay.
So this is taken from a photo. And if this is not just a drawing, it's probably taken from other photos. This is taken from a photo or a photo, in fact. But it's a collage in that sense.
Well, if nobody wants. Yeah, okay, there you go.
About the narrative, especially about the Suez Campaign, when we hear you, we have like this impression that the Ottomans were always, militarily speaking, losers. But we know, they fought, let's say, strategic battles, and they won. We have Kot al-Amara in Iraq, we have Gallipoli, we have the two battles of Gaza. And when it comes about is between like that they were in these pictures, let's say, well-dressed with military shoes, and between also the narrative, or let's say the diaries of Sakakini or Ihsan Tarjuman. We have also other documents or diaries like, for example, Khalil Tota, for example, who was recruited for the army in 1914, and he speaks, he gives on details his training in, let's say, in Jerusalem and in Bir al-Saba, Beersheba, and it showed that, and I even showed to Mustafa this whole document of a Birawi soldier. He's a peasant, small Birawi, with the detail, this book given to him with all the details inside, which gives really an idea. And I was shocked because I had the same impression, but you have details about his coming to the training. It's well organized. That's one thing. The other thing, it's about really that your conclusion. I liked a lot the lecture and had excellent details, and many are new for me, but this conclusion about the historicity of photo is in question. The historicity of any source is in question. Even documents, even official documents, oral history. This is what I wrote a lot about it. You have to deal with it. It's the way how you deal with these documents. It's not, you can't take for granted. We know that one of the main documents of the World War I, which is about, the Russian decision for the mobilization, was falsified to be 2 days later, because this was the main, let's say, incident of the war. The Russian mobilization. And the Russian as Clark, in his book, the new book in 2009, he showed that the document was falsified, and the French falsified the document. So, whatever we are talking, I mean, sources must be checked and cross-checked all the time. And I see really that here we are, I don't see that the Ottomans here or the Turks twisted the history. I mean, these were like for protocol, twisting, if we are talking about twisting, like, or fabricating history, if you have your dead people or what we saw in Syria, for example, the regime tried to publish some information about the killing done by himself and show that it's done by the opposition. I mean, this is twisting of the picture. But in this case, I don't see, from what we saw here, these, and not to forget that mainly these are 1915. I mean, it was before the war became so brutal, so bloody, so it's a little bit difficult, let's say, judgment about history. We know that the picture of this Vietnamese girl, I mean, changed the history. I mean, which was burned by the napalm during the Vietnam War. I mean, you wrote yourself about this picture of Nijm from Ramallah in the coffin, and it's after 100 years. We are in front. We cry. I cried when I saw this picture, and it was taken 100 years. So I mean, despite everything, I think pictures is an important document of history. But nevertheless, they must be checked and, let's say, investigated like any other document, including the main official documents.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, I agree with you on the premise, and all historical documents should be questioned. But I think what makes photography a little bit more special is that it was not seen exactly as a document per se. It was, it is, how can I put it? Let's say there is an ideological element in how you want people to see certain things. What I'm trying to do here is to reveal, not that I'm surprised that pictures lie, but what I'm trying to do here is to point to the possibility of a particular ideological twist that is consistent in all of these photographs that we've looked at in relationship to World War I. So it's more about how do you construct an imagination of the war in a way that is not real. And of course this is happening today. I mean, you know, in the Iraq War, or, you know, if you remember the first week of the victories of Saddam, there was always, I forgot his name now, Sahaf, who would come out and talk about all these victories, and, you know, Baghdad has been occupied and he didn't even know, or you know, pretend to know. So yeah, that's always true. But I think at that point, and today of course, but at that point, this new medium of visualizing a place that's far away or so problematic was so important for people that, according to some studies about civil war in the United States, people almost confused. I mean, the authenticity of the Civil War becomes connected with this idea that whether what you're talking about resembles the photographs or not. So there is a particular power of imagination associated with those images. Even if we question them and we say they're not correct and they were staged, etc., etc., that imagination sinks in and it becomes almost the judge. And that imagination in this in my particular talk is clearly ideological, in the sense that it's you know, twisted, but it's also in the classical definition of ideology, reality on its head. A defeat presented as a victory, basically. Thank you.
I think this is why I'm relatively, well, maybe frustrated is a big word, but I can't really get at what is the ideology at work here, if you want to call it ideology. I mean, I can see where the projection of the image is used instrumentally for some purpose, but I'm not quite sure that you've told me exactly what the end result is. And if you look at this, where you did the comparison of Kaiser Wilhelm and Jamal Pasha, I mean, with Kaiser Wilhelm, it's very clear. Every photograph he took, it was staged. He had to turn to the right every time to hide his deformity. But I don't see anything at work with in the second photograph. I mean, I look at it, and it doesn't convey what the imperialism of the Kaiser's photo is not necessarily. It's so obvious.
Yeah.
But with Jamal Pasha, it seems like his friend took a picture of him after tea or something.
Well, I'm guessing in this particular picture, I'm suggesting that the Khalil Rad, who probably not as professional and doesn't have that much of experience, is trying to imitate these kinds of pictures, not necessarily this one. So the pose is from the side. He's not looking at the camera. He's looking somewhere else. It follows a whole tradition that is known in portrait paintings from late Middle Ages and early modern age. But what strikes me about this is that it humanizes him. I mean, this is not a photograph. Okay, the Kaiser paid the guy who took this picture, but the Kaiser was pleased with it. But this picture could easily illustrate how ruthless the Kaiser was. It could illustrate, it could be used against him. In some sense, this picture hardly can be used against him. It has this almost human feature, humane. So I'm suggesting that there is I don't know if there's an ideology in the sense of political ideology. What are they mobilizing and lying to us that we're winning so we can all support them? I doubt it. But I think if my guess is, what I'm trying to hint at is that it is possible that Jamal Pasha was trying to build himself up for a future role. And there are suggestions here and there, no proof of anything, that he was trying to build himself up to maybe become a sultan of, or some authority, some leader, somewhere be it in Syria or in this particular region. So I'm seeing it as part of an attempt to build up the image of this guy. Especially, I compared these images with the few photographs I've seen of him when he was in Iraq, chilling with the tribal leaders, basically, not standing in the same sense and not presiding over victorious celebrations, but having dinner or standing with everyone else. So there is clearly a different persona emerging of Jamal Pasha in these images.
Sam, I can't remember, is this picture of Jamal also in the album?
No, it's not.
It's
this
not.
is from the Khalil Rad collection.
Uh-huh. Very
But-
interesting. It's also, his chest is not out like in his other post pictures, and he's also not heavily decorated there. It's a very modest.
Exactly. It is very modest, yeah.
Yeah.
There are several that looks like it, taken by various people, and this is the one that strikes me. And of course, this is all subjective, but that that brings a human element in him somehow, and I think that's.
Can you date it? Do you know roughly?
I think it's 1915, but it doesn't have a date. But we know of Rad traveled and during the war and ended up in Vienna for some time. So it must have been 1915 when he was visiting, or I don't know, visiting, but when he spent some time in Jerusalem.
Let me just follow up. This is a stretch, but you mentioned something about the lack of receptivity on the part of Muslim culture for visual representations, and yet here you're using these images as a means to sort of confirm authority. And isn't there a tension between these two statements in the sense that, on the one hand, you are trying to popularize an image through a relatively new and maybe unpopular medium, But at the same time, isn't it sort of at the same time, doesn't it sort of dilute the authority of the individual based on the culture of that you know the imperial the culture of the imperial authority of the Sultan, where he's not necessarily seen, always sort of hidden. And here suddenly you have this kind of explosion in imagery, or
No, when I talked about the Muslim culture's attitude towards photography, that was in the early days, basically, and it's probably more of the popular perception. So I think there's a class element here. I don't think Jamal Pasha was particularly concerned with how the peasantry would see his image. These are, if he cared at all, it would be images presented to the, Sublime Porte or to Anwar or to the Sultan, or to the elites, basically, the notables in the region itself, in Syria and in Jerusalem and in Beirut and other places, who are already, starting to perceive themselves as elites in the kind of, they're already starting to use the medium of photography to present themselves as elites in the same manner as the European elites are presented. And that very popular trope at the time is, photographers in the region had clothing and settings in their studios, so you can go, if you were a foreigner and you wanted to, let's say, an American visitor, can go dress up as a Bedouin. But on the other hand, they also had European dresses for the aristocracy, basically. Not that they did not dress that way, but basically to look more like the queen or something like this. So there were all these elaborate ideas about, how to culturally look European in a way, meaning to look modern in this sense. I don't know if that answers part of your question.
To add to that, your comments make me recall a conversation we had in the seminar of mine. We were talking about propaganda and the strange dearth of propaganda within the Ottoman Empire of its own people. I'm wondering if what you're saying is true, that most people, regarded photography with some negative feeling. Does that help us explain, or does that tie into then the lack of production of photos for public consumption, whether it be on posters or postcards, and so on, and whether, and are they just taking photos, as you were saying, to prove that they're doing a good job back in Istanbul or something? Is that your sense then, or
it's a possibility? I mean, that's my sense, but of course we cannot prove there are no records or any statements made in this regard, but certainly, and it follows the whole tradition of official Ottoman photography. If we look at the collections of Abd al-Hamid, were basically, photographing the Ottoman homeland, sending photographers everywhere, did not include photographing the peasantry working in their field. It was basically photographing the officials, photographing the soldiers, the imperial or sultani schools, that kind of thing. So it was also an attempt to look at the elite that is kind of connected with the state power in some sense or another. So I don't know if we can call it just typical disregard for the poor, or we want to call it Ottoman Orientalism, as someone already did, I think. But clearly there was complete disregard for the majority of the population.
But could be even fear. I mean, I wonder if there were attempts to do. I'm sure Germans could have easily told them, "Well, this is what we do to stoke morale of the population, or get people to stay in the army and fight and not desert or something." And I don't know.
I have not found so far any posters, any Ottoman posters for before the war or after the war. So this whole idea of the poster was not popular for some reason.
But postcards were very popular.
Postcards, yes, but postcards are consumed by people who buy them. Posters are placed in certain areas. But there were lots of other images. I mean, some of the more peculiar images of boats being pulled on the horses in Jerusalem. And you know, the photographs and all the officers in there are proudly standing on the boats. And this was, photograph is of a propaganda event in preparation for, you know, the attack on the Suez Canal. That here are our boats going to the Suez Canal. They're being pulled by mules and etc. in an area that, you know, I mean, you need to go to the Suez Canal and to bring boats. You don't really have to go by land in this area, you know. You can just simply go by sea. I mean, at least to Gaza, if nothing else. So that clearly they were conscious of propaganda efforts, but.
Is that where they were going? I thought they were on the Dead Sea.
Well, so they're also the Red Sea, but
Because they
there was
were
also,
supposed to bring in food from the
Yeah.
surrounding area.
Yeah.
Were there no illustrated magazines published in Jerusalem during the war?
I'm not familiar of any. There were some newspapers, but not else.
And they published photos?
No,
No.
not at that point. In Istanbul there was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there are a number of papers in the Arab land of the Ottoman Empire that continue to operate during the war.
But
And
did they have photos?
They have some photos. Yeah.
Be interesting to look at.
Islam, can I just add one thing on to Osama's point about portraiture and this sort of stuff, and Muslims? In the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate in Jerusalem is that beautiful portrait of one of the Khalidis, right? Have you seen this one? I think it's Muhammad. I don't know if it's Muhammad Ali.
I'm trying to remember.
It's right when you walk in.
Is it Yusuf Diya al-Khalidi?
No, it's like his father or something. I don't know. It's one of the Khalidis. But it's this very sort of 19th century portrait. I mean, it's a painting.
Yeah.
And he's sitting in kind of this, the Jamal Pasha style. And it's interesting that it's in the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate and not in the Khalidi family.
Yeah.
But if you decide to explore this, I think there's a number of these things floating around out there that may kind of tell more about portraiture and
Yeah.
representation in this period.
Thanks.
All right, well, once again, thank you very much.
Thank you.